Hello guys and welcome back. Today we have something a bit more unusual on our workbench. A 3D printed sci-fi Star Wars inspired tank from VoidArmoryMini. This is my first time working on a fully 3D printed tank model, so let us see how it goes. The tank comes in 4 pieces, the main body, turret and 2 side guns. The quality looks good and the whole thing feels really sturdy for a usually more fragile resin kit. I start by applying a layer of cheap black primer from a rattle can. Since this primer is meant for all kinds of surfaces, it should provide me with a sturdy base layer for all subsequent colors. After the black, the base layer for the tank follows. I am taking inspiration from the other Star Wars vehicles of the Grand Army of the Republic. Mainly the LAATI gunship and the TX-130 Saber class fighter tank, and painting the whole thing white now. White on black certainly wasn't my best decision, though I only realized that after I have already painted the vehicle black. Still, the white paint from Vallejo does have good coverage at least. And here is how the whole thing looks now in white. Even though the clone troopers originally wore completely white armor, I still like to add a bit of color here. Therefore, I'm now going to try to mask off a few areas using masking tape. And now I am painting these areas in a vibrant red. This should create a nice contrast, and as previously mentioned, it is one of the Republic's primary colors. I simply looked for spots that stood out somewhat from the rest of the vehicle or were visibly separated. Now I can peel off the masking film, and I'm curious to see how many spots I will still have to touch up. The results actually look quite clean, although unfortunately a few areas have a reddish haze, which I then had to carefully go over again with white. I wanted to try out some brushwork on the turret, but I very quickly realized why I dislike working with a brush, and why I bought an airbrush so early on. I would have simply needed far too many coats, and in the end the brush strokes would likely have remained visible anyway. That is why I subsequently painted the entire turret red using my airbrush. This part here is presumably an engine. The brushwork went a bit better on this one, and to make it stand out visually from the rest, I used a metallic silver. Up here at the front we have a few shapes without a specific function. Here I opted for green accents, again drawing inspiration from familiar vehicles within the Star Wars universe. At the back of the tank we have something that looks like fuel tanks. To make them stand out a bit and add another splash of color to the whole piece, I painted them a bright yellow. And here at the front and on the sides we have the coat of arms of the Grand Army of the Republic. Since it is raised slightly from the rest of the surface, it is very easy to paint it with a brush. I didn't want to leave the turret entirely red, so I painted the radar dish dark grey. And I also painted the tracks dark grey. Since the whole vehicle comes as a single piece, there isn't really much visible track anyway. Now that we have applied all the colors, it's time for some details. I'm starting with a silver dry brush. On the black and dark grey areas, it creates a truly beautiful metallic effect. However, dry brushing also works to great effect on the rest of the vehicle. It allows me to accentuate the many edges and raised details, while simultaneously creating the impression of heavy, sturdy metal plating, thereby conveying the sheer weight and size of the tank. The Star Wars vehicles from the Clone Wars series were already highly stylized due to their animation style. Consequently, I can take a somewhat looser approach with the effects here. High contrasts and heavily emphasized wear and tear may not be photorealistic, but they align better with the source material of the animated series. The same applies to the subsequent wash. I would never use a wash with such strong contrast on any of my other more realistic models. But here, that dark, almost black shade is exactly the tone I was aiming for. With this, I move just one step closer to the animation style, which too features a form of line art. Individual panels and details are separated from the rest and emphasized by means of hard lines. The dark wash simultaneously serves as a filter to create soot and dirt effects. After all, this is going to be a tank right in the thick of battle. It certainly shouldn't look pristine white and clean. And then it happened, the disaster. I moved the turret, it slipped out of the painting jig and plummeted straight towards the floor. As you can see, neither of the gun barrels survived the fall. While resin parts can usually be glued back together quite well thanks to their clean breaks, there is a problem. One of the gun barrels must have been transported to another dimension when it snapped, because I simply cannot find it anymore. The muzzle brakes and the connections to the turret are still there, but I now need to find a replacement for the missing barrel. Luckily, I have some round plastic profiles that are roughly the right diameter. That was really frustrating, because for a moment I thought that was the end of it. My replacement doesn't look quite as nice as the originals, but at least it allows me to keep working. After the unintentional destruction, the intentional damage follows. Sponge chipping. Here too, I don't need to aim for the same level of detail as on my other tanks. A simple dark grey works perfectly for this. I will now go over the entire tank with this, adding small scuffs and paint chips everywhere. I think the chipping was a very good decision, because before, the whole thing still somewhat looked like a toy. However, the paint chips now add the necessary details and irregularities that make it look like a real combat vehicle again. I particularly like the color contrast here at the red turret. It reminds me somewhat of an oxide red tank with grey steel. Maybe I should build something like that in the future? An E100 perhaps? Or what do you guys think would be an interesting base for a tank in oxide red primer? Now at the front of the tracks, I can use a brush to paint on some light scratch marks. And, of course, a bit of mud is an essential element of the Star Wars universe as well. To depict a nice thick layer of mud, I'm using diorama mud from AK Interactive in dark brown. I first apply it to the underside of the hull and then blend it with a little water to achieve softer transitions. And this is what the effect looks like after drying. Naturally, this shouldn't be missing from these sides either. Here the model features a lovely edge that is perfectly suited for catching dirt. The wheels are the only part of the 3D model that didn't turn out quite so well. But we will just slap a bit more mud over them and then nobody will be able to tell the difference. At the rear, I leave the mud a little higher, as it would be thrown upwards by the tracks. Unlike on my Jagdtiger for example, I won't be overpainting this mud effect here. The AK product dries to a very nice, dark, matte finish all on its own, something that I really like. I will just add a few fine splatters of mud. For this I'm using an enamel effect by Ammo by Mick. I dip an old brush into the effect and then blow air over it using my airbrush. This creates a fine mist full of tiny mud splatters over the entire vehicle. The fine splatters now add just a tiny bit more texture and are very subtle differences in color. In this case, that is enough for color variation for me. Unlike in real life, the mud on a Star Wars planet would actually likely be completely monochromatic. And with that, we have already wrapped up this little mini special project. Since we were able to skip the entire assembly process here, the whole thing really went relatively quickly. And for once, it was something completely different from the usual projects. Especially when attempting a stylized approach, you really have to employ a few different techniques or adapt familiar ones. In any case, this was certainly an interesting project for me. 3D printing is becoming an increasingly prominent part of the model building hobby. I have also just started a very interesting 3D printing project of my own. One you will hopefully see on my channel in the future, provided everything goes according to plan. Thanks again to VoidArmoryMini for the vehicle. As soon as I find the time, the tank will definitely get a nice diorama to go with it. If you'd like to pick up this model, or any other from the collection for yourself, you can find all the links in the video description. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to never miss any future uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and see you next time.